I want to welcome everybody as it's now 9:31 for Psalm 80. And it delights me that we're now, moving the odometer on the first digit so that we're starting our 80s this morning. And this psalm, from a phrase that gets repeated three times,
Yeah.
is is entitled Restore Us. And in that regard, I have taken the lead from Ari Katz to think of who a presentation reminds one of and dedicated to that person. So this morning's study is dedicated to Sybil Miller. It makes me happy, Sybil, to see you back. And I say back because Sybil has just had some surgery for the second time. First time surgery on her leg with regrettably a device that was defective. And so having to go back into surgery means the need for faith in the future. And this is a psalm that is about being restored. And I have delighted having you, Sybil, in our classes before surgery, and now a prayer with this study for your complete healing, and that you should go, from strength to strength and be dancing soon. And we're all post COVID able to dance together. So, again, dedicated to Sybil this morning. Psalms are poetry with purpose, particularly the Psalms of Asaph, which we're still in the flow of. We'll continue with these Psalms by a composer, Asaph, until Psalm 83. So we'll have four of them. Are Psalms that are deeply poetic in a variety of ways. The poet is taking echoes, phrases from elsewhere, from the Bible, and weaving those into the psalm. That's one aspect from the biblical writer's point of view. He's within a context of relationship with God through the prophets, through the Bible, and he's building on that. He also uses images as a poet, and today's key image is not only for Psalm 80, it's God as Vintner. Now, the nature of a vintner, first of all, vines and grapes are very much identified with Israel and the Middle East. It's remarkable, as an aside, how the wine industry, particularly quality wines, are flourishing in Israel today. And in Isaiah, in Hosea, in Jeremiah, in Ezekiel, there are images of the vine as a metaphor for Israel. I mentioned when we began our study yesterday with what was a painful psalm that when we read Psalms, there's three levels. We read it from the perspective of the poet. And of course, we don't know for most Psalms like today when a psalm was written or who the psalmist was, what the psalmist was thinking. But we do know that there's a style of, again, being immersed in biblical writing that was probably oral for the audience that's listening. And then there's a second level, and that's how did the rabbis, how did they read these psalms, particularly because much of Jewish history has been in exile from the land of Israel. These psalms, with whatever may have been their original intent, were written as psalms of hope making in the midst of exile. Not only hope making, but also, as we saw yesterday, pain venting. And there's an element where, again, the audience is God. And with God, you can speak honestly, unfiltered. But this is poetry, and every word is purposeful. And one other aspect of this is poetry. There's often rare words used. A word that will not appear anywhere else in the Bible, hapax legomen, or in the case here, a word that appears only once elsewhere, which allows for, if you will, different translations because the words are given meaning out of context rather than a variety or a common use of a word. And so, in sum, even before I begin to read this psalm, I will say that the following is the refrain that occurs 3 times and divides this psalm. By the way, you know how I often like to look for the bullseye of a psalm? Like, what's the middle word? This psalm, according to the Talmud, will be the middle word of all psalms. So we'll come back and I'll show you that. There's some unusual graphic scribal qualities to this psalm, but the key refrain will get repeated 3 times, verse 4, verse 8, and then the very end, verse 20. The only difference will be the name of God will be different in these 3 refrains. Here's the refrain. I'll do it without the Hebrew. The first time, verse 4, God, restore us, cause your face to shine, and we shall be delivered. Now there you can already hear an echo, the echo of the priestly blessings, Numbers 6:25, Ya'er Adonai panav elecha v'chuneka. May God shine God's face upon you and do so graciously. Now there's an echo for the time of the temple, when the priests would go into the courtyard each day and echoing from the book of Numbers 6:25, words to bless the people. So the refrain of this psalm is the refrain of the time of closeness to God, of a functioning temple flourishing. All right, with that, I'll leave to answer later why the names for God keep changing according to the commentators. And last, that's a longer introduction this morning. We'll want to leave time for your reactions. But now to share Psalm 80, I'm going to, as I do, read this psalm. Then I'll go back and point out some of the double entendres, some of the different ways things are translated and understood, and leave time at the end for restore us. In what ways, and again, I'm looking to Sybil, in what ways is this a psalm that gives us uplift? Because the third and most critical level is these words, to what degree can they be our words? Psalm 80. For the conductor to Shoshanim, a testimony, a psalm of Asaph. Shepherd of Israel, give ear. Who leads as a flock, Joseph, enthroned upon the cherubim, appear. Before Ephraim and Benjamin and Manasseh, stir up your power and go toward a deliverance for us. God, restore us and cause your face to shine, and we shall be delivered. Adonai, God of hosts, how long will you fume at the prayer of your people? You have fed them bread of tears and made them drink tears in triple measure. You set us at conflict with our neighbors, and our enemies speak among themselves in mockery. God of hosts, restore us and cause your face to shine, and we will be delivered. A vine from Egypt you transported. You drove out nations and planted it. You cleared space before it and sank roots and filled the land. Covered were the mountains with its shadow, and its branches of mighty cedars. It sent out its boughs until the sea, and to the river its shoots. Why have you torn apart its fences? So pluck it all passers-by? Ravaging is the boar out of the wood, and that which moves in the field feeds on it. God of hosts, do restore, please. Look from heaven and see, and remember this vine, and of the shoot, which was planted by your right, and the child whom you embraced to you. Burnt in fire, chopped up from the rebuke of your face, they perish. Let your hand be upon the person of your right, upon the mortal whom you embrace to you, and we will not turn away from you. Revive us, and with your name we will recall. Adonai, God of hosts, restore us. Cause your face to shine, and we shall be delivered. And again, I linger on this closing verse. Hashivenu, restore us. Ambiguity. What is this refrain, verses 4, 8, and 20, referring to? It can mean restore us to you, God. It can mean restore us to our former state. But the word hashivenu can also mean respond to us or relieve us. And this is the nature of great poetry. It means either one of those four or all four together. That the refrain implies that there is a God that listens to these words. It implies that it's a God who is responsive to our words, and more, who has the power to change our plight. And so, restore us is multivalent. It has many possible elements of yearning. To start from the beginning, Shoshanim means roses. We don't know what it means exactly, the conductor here of Shoshanim. Rashi will comment that it is a psalm, Rashi again, 1040 to 1105 in France, who will experience the Crusades, who's in the depths of exile. He'll say Shoshanim is a reference to exile, that we are surrounded by thorns as we seek to bloom. Again, that's the three levels of reading a psalm. What it was intended, which is an unknown, how it was read, all the more throughout much of Jewish history being in exile, and how we who don't feel in exile per se, how we relate. A testimony. Shepherd of Israel. The second verse has echoes to this week's Torah reading. So as there are no coincidences, in Parsha Vayechi, which we'll read, Jacob will go to bless his grandsons, and he will say, God was my shepherd. And then in the next chapter, in 49:22, Joseph is a fruitful son, like a fruitful vine by the fountain, with branches running over the wall. And you can hear that verse 49:22 of Genesis in this reference here to God as shepherd, leading a flock of Joseph. Enthroned upon the cherubim, that's God, and that's the immediacy of God in the time of a tabernacle. Now, verse 3, back to varieties of ways that something can be read. Before Ephraim and Benjamin and Manasseh, stir up your power and go toward a deliverance for us. And so the question is, why these tribes, Ephraim, Benjamin, and Manasseh? You do know that Joseph and Benjamin are children of Rachel. Ephraim and Manasseh, they are the children of Joseph. And as Joseph, in the rules of primogeniture, gets a double portion of land in Israel, Ephraim and Manasseh will each get their own territory, and Ephraim will become the largest of what will later be the nation of Israel, the 10 northern tribes. So we don't know when this was written. Benjamin Siegel will say very early on, when there was still or just after the 10 tribes. Again, they break away, the 10 tribes, just after Solomon, and the exile will be in about, well, it will be earlier than, Benjamin Siegel will say that it's prior to the exile of the destruction, exile. Now I'm getting oriented. The exile of the north is 722, and Benjamin Siegel will say this is written before that exile. He'll rely on one other linguistic feature, and that's the imperfect, which is present and future tense, used here as also past tense from context, which would place it early. But I tend to think that it could be later as well. For instance, listen to these words from the prophet Isaiah, which is First Temple. My beloved had a vineyard on a fruitful hill. He broke the ground and cleared it of stones and planted it with choice vines. He built a watchtower inside it. He even heard a winepress in it, for he hoped that the vines would yield grapes. Instead, it yielded wild grapes. Now then, dwellers of Jerusalem and men of Judah, you be the judges between me, capital M, and my, capital M, vineyard. What more could have been done for my vineyard that I failed to do in it? Why, when I hoped it would yield grapes, did it yield wild grapes? Now I am going to tell you what I will do to my vineyard. I will remove its hedge, that it may be ravaged. I will break down its wall, that it may be trampled, and I will make it a desolation. Well, those are fairly close to the words here of the description of the vineyard. We'll come back to that, which would mean this could be in and around the time of the First Temple, either a common motif or even a psalm written after Isaiah. Why Ephraim, Benjamin, and Manasseh? Here's at least three possibilities to emphasize this love relationship to Rachel, as we're reading in our Torah reading, how Jacob's love for Rachel was distinctively close to his heart. Ephraim, Benjamin, and Manasseh are described in Numbers 2, verses 18 to 24, as being camped together. It's also a model for the northern kingdom. But then the first refrain is with God's name as Elohim. That's the generic name for God. The name of power. It's the job description. God, it's your job to restore us and cause your face to shine, and we shall be delivered. But then Adonai, verse 5, begins with Adonai, Elohim Tzvaot, the God of hosts. How long will you fume at the prayer of your people? And the use of the word here for the first time of God's intimate name will only reappear in verse 20. In that sense, it's part of the envelope, perhaps, as is this next name of God in verse 5, God of hosts, which is what will be God's name also in verse 20. The image of God fuming we get elsewhere in the Torah, in the smoke. But here's again a double entendre. Ashanta can be smoke. That's why the verb here is fuming, a quality of anger. We say it in English. They were so angry they were fuming. Well, that is an echo of the Bible. Vayichar af. God's nostrils were aflame. The commentators will point out that when is fuming, that creates a barrier, a cloud to the prayers reaching God. You know, that's the image we have of Ne'ilah, on Yom Kippur, where our prayers are going up to reach God. And again, the fumes are an impediment. So God, you're blocking our prayers by your anger, is part of the image. And look what you're doing to us. This again is the expression of pain. And I talk about healing. Healing requires owning pain. Mourning requires acknowledging loss. You have fed them bread of tears, made them drink tears in triple measure. Biblical commentator will note that when somebody is crying, they're not hungry. You've taken our appetite away, for we're left with tears in triple measure. You set us at conflict with our neighbors, and our enemies speak among themselves in mockery. And that image we saw yesterday, and it's a recurring image, which is when they not only mock us, they mock you. And now again, the refrain, verse 8, God of hosts. And here's the new name for God, which we were introduced to in verse 5, God of hosts. Usually, hosts represents God's heavenly circle, the God's angels who do God's bidding, who are God's army. It's a warrior God. But Rashi will also say that Simpson Raphael Hirsch, Frankfurt, Germany, 19th century, will say, we are your hosts, God. We may have strayed from you, but we are those who love you. We are the ones loyal to you. So again, a double entendre that God of hosts can refer to the heavenly hosts. It can refer to God of power, but it can also refer to the people of Israel who are loyal to God. And now this image, an image that has this quality of history. A vine from Egypt you transported. You took us out of Egypt. You drove out nations and planted it. The nations are the 7 nations in Canaan. And now verse 10, you cleared space before it and sank roots and filled the land with the vineyards. And now this imagery that I think of Jack and the Beanstalk in terms of branches as mighty as cedars. And this vineyard, again, it's a metaphor for Israel, but also this quality of supernatural productivity. Covered were the mountains with its shadow. They were so huge, the vines. You have the image of the scouts coming into the land of Israel. You know the image of the Israel tourism, where 2 scouts carry one cluster of grapes. The grapes were so large. As these images are presented of the supernatural success, it sent out its boughs, its branches, unto the sea and to the river it shoots. Verse 12 is a description of the ideal borders of Israel. See Deuteronomy 11, verse 24, or Joshua chapter 1, verse 4, where the land that God bequests will be from the desert to Lebanon, from the river, which is understood as Euphrates, to the Mediterranean, from the south to the north, from the west to the east. So it was. The bows were from the sea to the river, and the river being usually identified with the Euphrates. Why have you torn apart its fences? That's the echo of Isaiah, what I read, in terms of the boundaries of protection, so that pluck it all passers-by. Anybody passing by takes from it. In this regard, now a commentary, and that is a vine, this is the medieval commentary, a vine is only as valuable as its grapes. The branches are not valuable. And that's a description of Israel. Why is that the image for Israel? Because it's only Israel's sweet deeds, their mitzvot, that are worthy. It's a hardy plant. It can survive harsh conditions, a vine. It can spread wildly, but its value is only its grapes. And now the middle letter of all of Psalms, verse 14. Ravishing is the boar, the wild pig, out of the wood, and that which moves in the field feeds on it. And you can see here that, one moment, you can see here that the ayin is, you can see that the ayin in verse 14 is elevated. Also, see verse 16, how the second letter, the chaf, is made large. These notations are 1,000 years after Psalms. That's when the scribes did it. So it was probably not, according to Bible scholars, in the original, though this ayin, that's the middle letter. And that's probably why it was, if you will, distinguished. Here's what Rashi points out in terms of a word play. And again, this is homiletic, that middle level of understanding. If you take out the ayin, what you get is yar, which means river. So in a river, if it's a river flowing, you are protected. Rashi will say, if you are faithful to God, you are on safe ground. But if you are disobedient to God, then the wild pig, the boar, will leap out of the woods. It won't be a river. It'll be a wild forest. And so the ayin, that middle letter, is the one of warning. The middle word, miya'ar. I will point out, sometimes when I count out these middle letters, I feel like I'm being a little obsessive compulsive. In the Talmud, I noted that they said that this was the middle letter and middle word, but they actually will also count how many phrases there are in the Psalms, and that middle phrase will have occurred earlier. One other contemporary commentary, and that's Richard Levy. So Kiddushin 30a is where in the Talmud this comment is made that this is the middle letter. And there are, in terms of verses, the rabbis count 5,896 verses, which means that the middle verse we've already passed. That was Psalm 78:38, but this is the middle letter. So it's already 10 o'clock because I did a longer introduction. Let me just pull this together before you react to say, why is God's name different in the refrain, verse 4, 8, and 20. Verse 4, it's Elohim. That's the generic God. Verse 8, that's God of hosts. That's the God of power, or potentially the God that sees us as God's army, which leads to all the words are the same except for the name of God. And now you get all three names. Adonai Elohim Tzvaot. As we return to the name of Yud-Heh Vav-Heh, as that's the culmination of the psalm, Yud-Heh Vav-Heh is God's intimate name. The name that you're not supposed to pronounce. The name that was only used by the high priest to ask for forgiveness in the Holy of Holies on Yom Kippur. Samson Raphael Hirsch, who I mentioned earlier, 19th century Germany, will say that it's a conflation of tenses. Haya was, Hoveh is, Yihya will be. When we use God's name in verse 20, it's to say our future God is controlled by you who are the God of time. Rashi will say Yud He Vav He is the culminating phrase to say there is reason to be hopeful of closeness yet to God reclaimed, that the more intimate revelation is there to overcome gloom. So to pull this together, this psalm is very tightly constructed. There's a lot more for me to say, and hopefully with some of your reactions in terms of word plays and echoes. But the flow of the psalm, which is our key focus today, is a psalm divided by refrains that enable a progression toward greater closeness to God, leading to a greater feeling of hopefulness that we will be restored. Whatever may be the ways in which we have felt broken, worthy of tears in our bread, this psalm, and that's the secret to Jewish both survival and return, indeed a restoration, is that, like this psalm, we are guided toward the faith of a better future. With that, I now go to seeing some familiar faces. Again, it's good to see Carl. It's been a while, and always when I see Ahuva, I smile with the expertise. And Vivian, good to see you looking better than you did last week. So, some reactions to Psalm 80. Canner Shula.
I wanted to, first of all, make note that there's one more translation to the word hashivenu, which is bring us back. And I think if you take that one, it is particularly clear, as you said, that there is a huge yearning to be brought back closer to God. Because aside from the fact that it says 4 times, bring us back to you, because we feel that this terrible suffering that we've had has really removed us, distanced us from you. In verse 15, it reverses it and it says, Shuvna. It talks to God and says, now you come back to us. So very clearly, within the pain of the suffering, the poet says, we've been sort of hurled away from you, but you also from us. So please, you come back to us too, because this distance, that is ultimately, as it says in 19, techayenu, that is what will give us back our life.
So let me build on I'm glad, again, there's so much in this psalm, and I want to thank Shula for bringing our attention to verse 15, which is in the middle of this third section, the section of God as Vintner. But as Shula points out, there's a variation on the refrain in terms of, instead of hashivenu, which is return us, restore us, with again the ambiguity whether it's to you or to our former state, and it's probably both. But here in verse 15, God of hosts, do restore, please. Look from heaven and see and remember this vine. And so there's the echo, which is not the refrain, of shuv as return, with this word na, please, that beckoning. And it comes really in the very middle, in terms of verse 15, in terms of this imagery of this third component. Thank you, Shula, for pointing again. Ahuva. Gotta unmute, Ahuva. Go ahead.
I thank Shula for supporting my idea about who wrote it and when, because Hashivenu, as you said, can mean return us, but I see it as physically return us. And because of the mentioning of Israel, Benjamin, Joseph, Ephraim, these are all northern tribes. And I think that it was written by a former Israelite who, after the exile of the 9 tribes, really 9 and not 10, many of those Israelites moved to Judah, escaped to Judah. And we know it from the archaeology of Jerusalem, how it was expanded at that time. So he is writing this psalm, asking God to return those exiled back to Israel, the land of Israel. Actually, return the people back. And he's asking for forgiveness for the way the Israelites had behaved.
So to echo and build on Ahuva's, and Ahuva again is a Bible scholar with an ear for context and language that would point to a time of writing. Benjamin Siegel also agrees with your analysis that this is very early on as a psalm. So when we say Asaph, because we had an Asaph yesterday, the day before, which was clearly after the destruction of the temple, in this case, there is no mention of a destroyed temple, which also points to an earlier composition, like Ahuva points out, a time between the exile from the 10 tribes and the destruction of the first temple. Is that right, Ahuva?
Yeah, I would say it's right after the exile of the northern kingdom.
Yeah, that's what I'm referring to, the 722 to 586, but even perhaps closer. And the Ugaritic poetry uses, which is the language of the Near East, often uses the imperfect, the tense of present to future for the past, which is part of this psalm, and again, another verbal cue to it being early. Having said that, and I want to return to Psalm 80 and how it's relevant for us, the power of the psalm is this psalm was read throughout much of Jewish history as a psalm of exile. Check out the following. There are 3 different sections, right? 3 refrains. Samson Raphael Hirsch will say the first section deals with the exile of the 10 tribes, 9 tribes. Verse 8, that refrain is dealing with the Babylonian exile, the destruction of the first temple. And verse 20 deals with the destruction by the Romans, which is the exile that he was living through, the post 70. So for Jews reading this psalm historically, this is a description of 3 destructions, 10 tribes, first temple, second temple, which is also to say that's the power of poetry. One can bring one's own experience, for Rashi, of exile, for Samson Raphael Hirsch, 19th century, Frankfurt, and see this psalm as transcending wherever, with a literary analysis, it may have been written, as being words that speak of hope in the midst of loss. And that's why Restore Us is a psalm that's to be read as an introduction. Richard Levy, in his commentary, he is the former head of Hebrew Union College in Los Angeles. he will say this is a psalm to be read whenever one is feeling vulnerable and needing hope to be restored. In that regard, and our dedication, this is a psalm for all of us in any time in needing of healing. One last comment for somebody, and then we'll pull it together for today. Do I see?
Rabbi, I have on
Go ahead, Sarah Cornell.
verse 16, I'm puzzled by the phrase, your son. I don't know that we've ever been referred to as Israel as your son.
So let me share that. And I literally, it's Ben, verse 16. I translated it, non-generically as child. Some commentators, even classic commentators, say that Ben should actually be binyan, meaning building, rather than son. Some see it as messianic, this of the shoot. Often David is referred to as the shoot of Yishai, Yishai being his father. And Yamincha rhymes Yamincha with Binyamin, Benjamin. This is a psalm for Benjamin, verse 3, the northern tribes. Yamincha, your right hand is the hand of your right, but there's an assonance, there's a kind of a echoing of Binyamin and Yamin here. So it's going back to the 10 tribes being referred to. One other interesting part of that same verse, verse 16, is the closing. Imatztalach, I translate as the child whom you embraced to you. But this word imatzta is one of those poetic words I mentioned that's rarely used and therefore is subject to more than one understanding. There are at least two clear ways that root is used. One is emates, which means adopted, and the other is amatz, which means strengthened, depending on the vowels you put under the consonants. So it could be read as the child whom you have strengthened or the child you have adopted, a reference to Israel as God's beloved. And that's why I choose embraced to you, embraced, being pulled with your arm toward you, the image of adoption. One closing, there's again too much to yet even be said, but listen to the power of the use of language of Asaph in this poetry. Verse 10, Penita lefaneha, which means you cleared up space before us. But in Hebrew, the echoing, Panita lefaneha, and the next phrase, Vitashresha rasheha, which means and sank roots, and Vitisharasha rasheha. So, and then it ends, Vitamale haaretz, filling up the land. So there's a quality of art in how this is written. Assonance, with words, with sounds to amplify, with rare words, with multiple possibilities. This is poetry where there is phrasing done purposefully with a subtle change of the name of God, leading toward a trajectory which leads to this final phase. How is this relevant for us? These are words, again, so artfully composed that they do transcend whatever place and time, because we do not know who the author is. We don't know when he or she wrote it, what was the prompt. But what we do know is that these, like many of the Psalms, have been words that have been a vehicle to express pain and not hide it. That's here. You made us drink the bread of tears. You who are smoking with anger. Why? The sense of feeling at a distance from God, and at the same time, words of hope. a building of closeness with the choice of the names of God, pointing toward a future. And it is hope that is one of the core ingredients of a religious mindset, an ability to look to the future as a better tomorrow. And with that, I thank everybody for sharing Psalm 80. Here's something cute to know. Psalm 81 is read every Thursday. It's the psalm that the Talmud directs for Thursday. We will be studying it tomorrow. And it's another psalm of Asaph, blast on the new moon shofar. It's where God talks. Tomorrow we hear God responding. And it's another, I am always fascinated when, as is most of this psalm, it's as if it's God addressing the psalmist. So that's for tomorrow. We conclude every day with the saying of Kaddish. I just want to say, as I go to Kaddish, what a joy it is for me to see my daughter Anna and sharing today's learning. And so Kaddish is said in honor of our loved ones, as we honor their memory. Yitkadal v'yitkadash shemei Rabbah.
Amen.
Be'alma divra kirute v'yamlich malchute. B'chayechon uv'yomechon uv'chaye dechol beit Yisrael. Ba'agala uv'izman kari v'imru amen. Yehei shmei Rabbah mevarach le'olam ol me'omaya. Yitbarach v'yishtabach v'yitba'ar v'yitromam v'yitnaseh. V'yitadar v'yitalev v'yitalal shemei dekudsha barichu. Le'ela min kol birchata v'shirata. Tushbechata v'nechamata damiran b'alma v'imru amen. Yehei shlama rabba min shemaya v'chayim aleinu v'al kol Yisrael v'imru amen. Osei shalom b'mromav hu ya'aseh shalom aleinu v'al kol Yisrael v'kol yoshvei tevel v'imru amen. Tomorrow's psalm is dedicated to Sarah and Cliff Cornell, often the first ones on. It's about waiting to hear God's voice. And again, today it was dedicated to Sybil. May you go from strength to strength in your healing. To each of you, may you be restored. To each of you, thank you for giving me energy and joy to begin my day through study. Be well. Take care.